Hello, Mr. Beard here with your class recap for Wednesday, April 25th. We began today with SSR. Keep in mind, as we're nearing the end of the school year, you want to really stay on top of due dates. Some of you may have accrued fines from the library. One way to alleviate the cost of those fines would be to bring in a canned good. For every canned good item you bring in and turn into the library, they will take $1 off of your late fee. It's a good way to give back to the community while also wiping away any library fines you may have. Our schedule today looks like this. We began with SSR, then we began talking about Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes is an interesting figure because he's one of the largest figures of the Harlem Renaissance that we talked about yesterday. Just as a quick recap, the Harlem Renaissance is a really important movement because you had all of these very talented African Americans coming together as a cultural voice. Although a unified voice, it was very different. You had jazz musicians and artists and poets, and all of them were speaking about different things, but they had very similar themes, such as social injustice and speaking out against the oppression of African Americans. Langston Hughes is one of those voices that was most pronounced and most persuasive. His poem called "The Negro Speaks of Rivers" is still one of the most powerful meditations on the mistreatment of African Americans throughout their history, and it's very focused on that element of the poem, or that element of society in the poem, I should say. Some of the elements that he looks at in the poem that we want to take a look at here include where he came from and how his people have dealt with the injustices that they faced in those places. So let's look at some of the places that he's come from. Originally, he speaks of the rivers in Egypt, and then in the river associated with that in Egypt is the Nile. Then we see him kind of fast forwards a little bit to America and Mississippi. And I'll just abbreviate that there. And the river associated with that, of course, is the Mississippi River. One of the things both places share in common, is the ugly tradition of slavery. So you see that slavery has sort of shaped his experience with the river in both places, and he uses the river as a physical landmark as well as a metaphor for the experiences people have gone through. And tomorrow we'll get a little more in depth with this and what that river means for the African Americans as a metaphor, because we did talk briefly about how his soul is deep now, like the river, which could explain how his people have gone through hardship, and it has deepened their outlook on the world and their outlook, in the suffering in their souls. So tomorrow we will get in more in depth with this poem, and we'll also get to read I Too, which is a response to Whitman, which if you think back to our poetry recitations, you guys all read. And so I'm looking forward to that. So thank you for listening. Have a good day.